So it is my pleasure to introduce Christian Welzel, who is a long time part of our Laboratory for Comparative Social Research. We appreciate him being here. And he'll present a lecture on Democracy Misunderstood. Chris, you have 40 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A period.
Yeah, thank you, Eduard. Thanks for the invitation. It's really a pleasure, actually an honor to speak in front of such a distinguished audience of public opinion scholars. Indeed, I'm also relating to public opinion data from the World Value Survey, and it's about notions of democracy that people in different parts of the world might have. I'm starting kind of from a puzzle, from a perplexing puzzle. At least I think it's a puzzle. Namely the fact that we observe when you look into regional barometers like the Afro barometer, Arab barometer, Asia barometer, Latino barometer, ISSP, International Social Survey Program, whatever public opinion data you look at, and you ask people for what kind of regime preferences they have, support for democracy is overwhelmingly large all over the world, even now, and especially in countries that are outright authoritarian or autocratic. And that is a little bit perplexing, at least for a scholar like me who started out when I studied in the beginning with the idea of congruence, which goes back to Harry Eckstein and of course Ullmann and Weber, which is to say that there should be a match or a close correspondence between the preferences for what type of regime you want to be governed by in a population and the regime that is in place. Obviously, the real world is in a striking contradiction right now with that assumption of congruence, and that is a little bit puzzling unless you believe that mass preferences are entirely irrelevant for what those in power are doing. Well, I try to convince you congruence is still in place, and very strongly so. We just have to look at it in the right way. And I will also argue that support for democracy around the world is not measuring what it is supposed to measure. In fact, I will make the point that in some countries, like Egypt, when you ask someone on the street and the person says, I support democracy, what that person has in mind is autocracy. So in some countries, it is measuring exactly the opposite what it is supposed to measure. And that is the whole thing about authoritarian notions of democracy. The World Value Survey has a battery of questions since round 5 of the survey, repeated in round 6 with a slightly different item set. A battery of questions where people are supposed to position themselves to various items that are saying what democracy in essence is meaning. So what it's about the definition of democracy, not whether I support it or not. There is other surveys who have done such batteries, like the European Social Survey. We did not take this as a blueprint because the European Social Survey, for example, only includes items that would be within what a political scientist would say, yes, these are definitional elements of democracy, like having a multi-party system, having an independent judiciary, having press freedom, having separation of powers, and all this list of things that you could say, yeah, these are definitional elements of democracy. What we did is different. We teased in a couple of items that say exactly the opposite of what democracy means in order to give people a chance to say, yes, that means democracy. This is the only way you can figure out if there are people around the world who have a twisted or a wrong notion of democracy. We're paying particular attention to 3 items here that I have marked, framed in red. So one item says, religious authorities ultimately interpret the laws. The other one says the army takes over when government is incompetent. And the last one simply turns the meaning of democracy around. It says people be their rulers. So these are three different versions of an authoritarian understanding, one relating to theocracy, the other military rule, and the third one is just making a very generic statement about democracy. Now, what we did in the next step, just for descriptive information, so let's see how these items are behaving to each other when we run a factor analysis across this item set. The interesting first observation is because several scholars, including myself, but also Pippa Norris or Do Shin, have used those liberal items and contrasted them with the authoritarian items by creating a difference index. Yeah? So you subtract support for the authoritarian notions from support for the liberal notions, which has some sort of justification because from the whole logic of because these items are contradictory if you really think about them. However, this is going with the assumption that we should have one dimension with two opposite poles, where one set of items is loading on the negative and the other set of items is loading on the positive. So a bipolar one dimension, but we don't have that. What we get from the factor analysis is two separate dimensions. And that is interesting because it tells you already that in the mindset of the people, these two notions of democracy are not adversarial. They are orthogonal. And the reason why this is the case, you would see that immediately if you go into the data. The liberal notions of democracy have very little discriminatory power over how people think because support for those items is almost universal. So we have scales from 0 to 1, and the average on those liberal items, the average support is at a 0.8. It's almost on the top of the whole scale where the average is located. And that means that among those who support liberal notions of democracy are a lot of people who also support authoritarian notions at the same time, which in my eyes invalidates those liberal notions because those people obviously do not understand the contradiction. Also, when you do a bipolar one scale, combining them in one scale where you do a difference index, what you're also doing, you're glossing over the fact that the authoritarian notions have much more discriminatory power over how people think. So the variance coefficient, the standard deviations or measures of dispersion are much larger with the authoritarian than they are with the liberal notion. So one of the conclusions I draw from this is that whether someone rejects authoritarian notions of democracy is a better maturity test of the person's civic mindedness than looking at whether the person embraces liberal notions. So a better acid test, if you would like to say. So we combined those three authoritarian items into one index to measure authoritarian notions of democracy, generally speaking. We did a formative index, so we do not care at all whether these three items have the same metric, scalar, whatsoever invariance in every country, because the logic, our starting point, our point of departure is the idea. These are partly distinct versions of an authoritarian notion, and they complement each other in forming authoritarian notions writ large, which means they are allowed to have separate variance components. So it is not necessary that they merge into a single dimension in each country in the same way. Formative index. Whether the index makes sense, you can see that from a simple univariate distribution. So this is the pooled sample, all countries, individual level distribution over this index. It's actually a pretty normal distribution. You see it's pretty bell-shaped, clustered around the mean. The mean, interestingly, is almost in the middle of the scale. So the scale can run from 0 to 1. The mean is at 0.46. The median is also almost exactly identical with the mean. So these are some desirable distributional features to analyze an index. Now, nevertheless, even if you do not create a reflective scale but a formative index, there are certain quality criteria that have to apply to justify the summarization of a couple of single items into a generic index. One take on that was, I was looking here in this table whether the generic index, which is abbreviated here as AND, whether that generic index maps stronger on theoretically expected antecedents or consequences of authoritarian notions of democracy. So I looked at cognitive mobilization, which is a combination of educational achievement and diversity of information intake. I looked at moral liberation, which is basically emancipative values, so an emphasis on self-determination, equality of opportunities, tolerance, and these kinds of things, which in my eyes are expected antecedents of the authoritarian notions of democracy in a negative sense. So when someone is stronger on moral liberation, someone is cognitively more mobilized, that person should be less supportive of authoritarian notions of democracy. And then I have two things that I would consider consequences, expected consequences of authoritarian notions of democracy. Protest participation should be lower among those with authoritarian notions. And then another thing where I would assume people who have an authoritarian notion of democracy, I would expect a positive effect. We asked people also in the survey, how democratic do you think your country is at the moment? And then you can relate this to objective measures of democracy, like polity, like Freedom House, like the data from the Varieties of Democracy, VDEM project. And then you can look if people overestimate their country's actual level of democracy. My idea was, if someone lives in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia or in China, and that person has an authoritarian notion of democracy, that person would probably consider her country as democratic, even though it is authoritarian, because the person defines democracy in authoritarian ways, in which case I would see China, Saudi Arabia, and these kinds of countries, many people giving their country a better score in how democratic it is than it is really. And we measured that. We created a difference index. So I was expecting here authoritarian notions of democracy relate positively to the overrating of democracy. Now the question was, in order to justify the summary of the three items into one index, the question was, does the summary index perform better in terms of correlation strength than each of its single components related to these four correlates? And that is the case, as you can see, and it is the case both at the individual level and the country level. You also see in the table that if you summarize the three liberal notions of democracy, labeled L and Ds here, you get correlations in exactly the opposite direction, which should be the case. However, they by a large magnitude, these correlations are smaller than the inverse correlations with the A and D index. Again, showing us looking at A and Ds is more telling about the maturity of the civic mindedness of a population than is looking at liberal notions of democracy. Also, let's see. Oh, this doesn't work. If you look at the second last row, I also controlled for, so you can imagine you have this overall measure of A and Ds, and a respondent can have a score of 0.7 or 0.6 or 0.5, whatever. But the same score can be produced by a different one item of the three ones being the lead one. Yeah, so the same overall score can come from different compositions of partial scores. And the question was, does that make a difference? And I was testing this, and the basic conclusion is it doesn't. which tells us there is compositional substitutability, which is important for a formative index because that is a requirement for a formative index that has to be fulfilled. All right. This is the distribution of countries over the index. So the larger bar, the larger is the support for authoritarian notions of democracy in a given country. The scale, the possible endpoints of the scale are 0 and 1.0. You can interpret the fractions also as percentages. So Egypt sticks out by far with a 0.85. So you can say 85% of the Egyptian sample have an authoritarian understanding of democracy. Germany is at low end, it's about 15% of the population, which is about the electorate of the AfD, our right-wing populist party right now. So this might also give us a little bit of an insight if we look into very mature democracies and at the potential electorate of parties who are on the right-wing end. You will also see if you go if you look at the top countries and you look at the bottom countries, there are a couple of obvious patterns. The top countries used to be mostly Muslim majority societies. The bottom countries used to be mostly Protestant, historically Protestant. The top countries used to be economically not so advanced. The bottom countries used to be economically highly developed. The top countries used to be not to be democracies or deficient democracies or hybrid regimes or fledgling democracies. The bottom countries used to be mature democratic countries. So you see there's a couple of clearly structuring patterns. The question is, but it's interesting, they've kind of conflated. You could now tell a religious, so a cultural tradition story, you could tell an economic development story, and you could tell a regime tradition story, but they are all confounded with each other. So you need multivariate analyses to figure out which is the stronger determinant here. By mere eyeballing, that is not possible. So our next idea was to think about what would be plausible factors that influence, that shape whether authoritarian notions are more pronounced or less pronounced in a given society. What we did, of course, is to go back to the authoritarianism, authoritarian personality literature, going way back all the way to Adorno and Brunswick and other authors who worked on this stuff in the 1950s. So one thing would be, from the viewpoint of institutional learning or democratic socialization, the most plausible assumption is that countries that have a long democratic tradition, in those countries, socialization mechanisms have probably matured to a point that people get it right by going to school, by growing up with parents who know what democracy is, by reading media outlets and getting it by the media. So they're exposed through their upbringing to proper notions of democracy, and it should make it more unlikely that people then support, embrace an authoritarian notion. So one idea is democratic traditions. Another idea is fear. And that goes more directly back to the authoritarianism literature. Adorno and many others have argued that people who are growing up under threat perception, under an authoritarian parental style, for instance, which involves corporal punishment, violence, and things like that, that induce fear into people, that would be a shaping factor. In this case, this would create a predisposition to more easily embrace authoritarian notions of democracy. So we have a measure of fear of physical threat, physical violence, also from the World Value Survey. We have that at the individual level, and we also have country level, aggregate level measures of that. But we also have a more direct take on repression and fear we're using the political terror scale, which measures state-sponsored human rights violation in a country. And the idea here would be that people growing up under such circumstances with a lot of state repression are constantly intimidated. That's one thing, but they're also exposed and used to see violence in daily practice, which might actually not create only fear from it, but also a certain form of being used to it and maybe even appreciation. Yeah? So we looked at state repression. Another idea was when we have states like the oil exporting countries, the Gulf monarchies, where you have particular structures of a political economy, a rent-seeking economy that feeds a patrimonial state where state monopolies cash in the revenues from the exports that do not have to tax their citizens, which is an important factor because you do not need to mobilize support from taxpayers if you don't have to charge taxes on people. So you can quite luxuriously subsidize your supporters and fund repressive mechanisms and apparatuses to intimidate your opponents. So a patrimonial state, when we take the per capita oil and gas rent in a country for measuring that, so a patrimonial state might be a factor that shapes authoritarian notions of democracy. And then we looked at religion. The authoritarianism literature has found out repeatedly that especially people who are strongly religious used to have, it's a statistical tendency, I'm not saying every person who is strongly religious is that way, but there is statistical a tendency that strongly religious people used to be more patriarchal in their family and sex values and norms, also more authoritarian in their attitudes and more dogmatic and stuff like that. And people have found out that this is independent from the particular denomination of the religion, as long, at least when we qualify that a little bit more, as long as we stay within the monotheistic religions, which is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But then again, others have argued that these tendencies are general tendencies of religiosity, but yet they are still more pronounced in Islam than they are in other religions. So we also look at the general strength of religiosity at the individual level and the country level. But we also look at whether a person individually is Muslim or not, and also how large is the percentage in a country who are denominational Muslims. Is that all? Pretty much that's the kaleidoscope of explanations, except one, and that is our favorite one. So we go back, Pippa Norris made that point. She analyzed these data and she said, like, you know, and she actually labeled her measure enlightened awareness. And we like that term, enlightenment. And we have a double take on that. One is, I mentioned that before, cognitive mobilization. People being exposed to education, information flows, knowledge production in a society. This is a form of intellectual empowerment in the sense that people who are more exposed to these cognitive forces probably are better capable to make their own judgments, to think for themselves. When you say that, when someone is more capable to think for herself, for himself, probably that person also wants to do that. So the emphasis on being self-determined, being independent of the moral interpreted authority of elites, like clerics and stuff like that, should be stronger. I call this moral liberation. And together we merge cognitive mobilization and moral liberation. We merge that into an overall measure which we call enlightenment forces. And that is our favorite predictor of authoritarian notions of democracy. Of course, an inverse predictor where the Enlightenment forces have grown stronger, support for authoritarian notions of democracy should be systematically lower. Here you see the bivariate correlations between authoritarian notions of democracy and the various predictors. And Enlightenment forces stick out as by far the strongest correlate. It's a minus 0.81. The two components are very close to each other. So minus 0.75 for cognitive mobilization, minus 0.79 for moral liberation. But if you summarize the two, it gets even a bit stronger and you get a minus 0.81. If you see this, you already know the outcome of a multivariate regression. It's only a technical execution. Nothing will retain significance when Enlightenment forces are in the game. And this is what we get from the multivariate regression country level. Here, authoritarian notions of democracy, the dependent variable. And we throw in as predictors only those variables that had at least a significant bivariate correlation in the table before. And it's interesting to see, because we have quite a sophisticated measure of democratic traditions using John Gehring et al.'s democracy stock variable, that this has such a little and actually a totally insignificant effect on that whole thing. By the way, this is the scatter plot. Enlightenment forces on the horizontal and authoritarian notions of democracy on the vertical axis. Now, but we shouldn't now cancel out democratic tradition, state repression, and the other factors as completely irrelevant. It might simply be that their effect is more indirect, so that they affect authoritarian notions of democracy via their impact on the Enlightenment forces. And that is pretty much what we get if we do a path analysis. So you would see that some of the influences that did not turn out as directly impactive on authoritarian notions of democracy are indirectly impactive by having an effect on Enlightenment forces. So state repression, Muslim dominance, and fear of violence have a strongly negative effect on the Enlightenment forces. So these are the brakes on that process of enlightenment, and then you have a strong impact on these authoritarian notions of democracy. Now, the question is, of course, causality, because you could now exchange in that path model the position of A and Ds and Enlightenment forces and make A and Ds the mediating variable and Enlightenment forces the dependent variable, and you get exactly the same coefficient. Just the difference would be that the causal error now goes from A and Ds to Enlightenment forces instead of the other way around. So the choice of that model is one rather of theoretical plausibility than of statistical necessity. But since we are confronted with that theoretical choice here, it is important to know what is the preferable model. So what we did is two things. We did a Durbin-Hausmann-Wu endogeneity test, where we tested whether A and Ds are endogenous to Enlightenment forces or the other way around. And do I have a slide on this? I guess, yeah. So here you can see the technicalities of that test. The result of this test was that Enlightenment forces are not endogenous to authoritarian notions of democracy. But authoritarian notions of democracy are endogenous to Enlightenment forces. And that would tell you clearly that switching the position of Enlightenment forces and A and Ds in the path model would be a misspecification of the data. This is a little bit more of a technical test, a more substantive test, we thought, would be the following. So you have a related pair of two variables that are in a close relationship. Then we thought, okay, let's take a third yardstick of comparison. So there is now a burgeoning literature on the remote historical drivers of development. So people looking at geographic variables, at biological variables, at early institutional choices, like early schooling, something that Rick is doing very convincingly. So we looked at a bunch of remote historical drivers relating far back into the past. And then the question was, if one of our two variables in the related pair is more closely anchored, rooted in those remote historical drivers, that is perhaps, or more likely, the driver in their bivariate relationship. And the result of that exercise is Enlightenment forces are by a large magnitude more deeply rooted in those remote historical drivers than is the case for authoritarian notions of democracy. Two more things. One concern in this business here, especially as we do public opinion researchers, do surveys in authoritarian societies, and we ask people for regime preferences, you cannot ignore that people in these countries are maybe under the pressure of the fear of sanctions. These countries have censorship. These countries disadvantage people when they make up their mind and say something in public that the regime doesn't like. So there is this phenomenon that Timur Kuran has once labeled in a book, public lies and private truths. I know this as a West German. We have that phenomenon when we talk to Eastern Germans after reunification, how people were telling us, you would say something about the communist regime at home when you have trust to people around you, but not in the open. If that is the case, it could be then that when people say they support authoritarian notions of democracy, it might not be their true preference. It might be a false preference that we measure here. If so, then, however, we have variables directly measuring fear of violence and state repression. Those should have a direct impact on the authoritarian notions of democracy, which they don't. That's one thing. Another take on this issue was, if you think of it, that someone in an autocratic country is in an interview situation and the person actually doesn't like the regime and would like to say something critical, but doesn't dare out of fear from repression. This is the classic situation of cognitive dissonance, according to Leon Festinger. And what type of behavior should that create? The easiest way out of the cognitive dissonance is response refusal, which means we should have systematically higher missing values, non-responses, where fear of violence and state repression is higher. This is not the case. So the correlation between these, the correlation in these relationships is zero. So there is a clear conclusion here that we cannot invalidate those authoritarian notions of democracy measured in authoritarian societies as false preferences, which has two conclusions. One is on the legitimacy of those regimes. They obviously have much more legitimacy in the eyes of their citizens than all the survey data seem to tell us when we look at support ratings for democracy. Because here the conclusion would be these regimes must be illegitimate because so many people say they support democracy but live in an authoritarian country. But our take on this issue shows, no, those regimes do have real legitimacy. The second conclusion is more of a research strategy one, and that relates to our community of survey researchers. Apparently, the data that we get from countries that are not perfectly, well, which country is perfectly, but are not at the top of the scores in measures of democracy, the survey data we get from these countries seem to be rather reliable. So the autocracy factor or authoritarianism factor does not create like this false preference phenomenon that we might be suspecting. All right, we had a bigger causal storyline here in which we try to frame this, and because another interesting thing as well, let me, the last slide maybe. Yes. There is a systematic relationship also to the way how people estimate their country's level of democracy. So on the vertical axis, you see when countries are higher above on the vertical axis, what that tells you is that the people in that country think their country is more democratic than Freedom House, Polity, VDEM, and other data tell you that they really are. So in Rwanda, in Kazakhstan, in China, Jordan, Pakistan, there's a lot of people who score their country on a democraticness scale very high, when in fact these countries are not very high. This is an overrating thing. You see that the scale can also go in the negative. And this is what's happening in the most mature democracies. This is underrating. So here, people obviously are more critical. So, and the reality more easily falls short of what people are expecting. So this is kind of interesting because this tells us something about people's expectation standards. And authoritarian notions of democracy explain that to a large extent. So the larger, the more prevalent these authoritarian notions of democracy are, the more likely people are to overestimate their country's level of democracy. And then you get really the explanation now why then in such countries there is not really a source of mobilizing pressure on the regimes to perform better in matters of democracy, because large chunks of the public think they are already democratic, right? So there is real legitimacy. So this translates in that bigger picture here. So you have lack of enlightenment, you get authoritarian notions of democracy, you get uncritical reality estimations, and from there, and we can show these linkages as well, I haven't done that here. From there you get weak social movement activity, weak pressures on those in power, at least on a sustained level. You might get fluctuating, short-lived uprisings and stuff like that, like hunger revolts, to simplify it, but those are not lasting. And then you get deficient or absent democracy, and that feeds probably itself back in to the lack of enlightenment. The positive part is you turn this all into the opposite, and you get the democratic equilibrium. Well, I'm really curious to your questions and criticisms and comments. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. We have some time for questions and answers. Rick?
Yeah, a couple of things. One,
Can you please turn on the mic on?
better? Okay, a couple of things. First, if you go back to your table 4, I would suggest that you use a one-tail test of significance rather than a two-tail test, at which point Muslim dominance becomes significant because it's 1.645. That's the magic number.
Yeah, thank you.
But then there's a larger question, which is purely theoretical and not a criticism at all. When you were talking about the authoritarian democracies and people's expectations, whenever I go to China, I hear people saying, we have a real democracy because your democracy is a mess, you can't get anything done, You have such bad campaign finance reform that the rich can buy everything. And we here have a far better system. Now, that may be delusional, particularly in the era of Xi, but this is an argument that one hears there.
Yeah, I mean, the technical thing is, I will take that. I will look at the one-tailed significance test. That's a good idea. What you say about China is actually highlighting what we need to do. So the alternative would be that we shift the yardstick of the definition of democracy into each culture and leave it to every culture to define it as they want to have it. But then we cannot compare anymore. And
no, I'm not suggesting you do that. I'm suggesting you just take note of the fact that different people may have different notions, because most places don't want to admit that their political system is a failure.
Yeah, I agree.
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the talk. I'm Ben Dettenberg from NTU Singapore. It was interesting to see where Singapore fell in your list of countries. There's thinking about looking at the state terror and the measures that you had there and the role that violence seemed to play. A number of authoritarian regimes, soft and hard, no longer resort to explicit violence. There are other means of social control which come into play. And my former colleague, Cherian George, developed this concept called calibrated coercion, in which he talked about the ways that the government was able to apply leverage, and there are various levers of social control. And so many states have moved away from explicit use of violence, torture, and other means because it is counterproductive. And so I'm wondering if you couldn't look at this, seemingly there's differences across that range of countries in terms of the experience. Certainly Egypt and other places, people do come into contact with day-to-day violence. But in many of these other places, Singaporeans haven't seen any kind of state violence in decades. So I'm wondering if you could just perhaps expound on what you think this might mean in terms of the softer forms of authoritarianism versus the stronger forms in relation to the predictors and the model that you have.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's Singapore is, of course, a very, very interesting, special case. Former colleague of mine actually was teaching there also for a while, Marco Verwey, he has written a piece in the Journal of Democracy actually criticizing that Singapore performs so well on quality of government indicators like control of corruption and stuff like that. And he argued if you look behind the curtains, you would see how the networking and the nepotism and the control apparatus really works. And this is disguised by these official measures. I would certainly pick up the idea and look at more subtle forms of silencing people. I thought about censorship and press freedom. We had that in the data set as well. It didn't show up as so strongly because its variation was pretty much absorbed by the democratic tradition variable. But this is certainly something to think about. If there was really a good measure on taking the more subtle forms into account, I would be happy to include that.
I would like to ask a question myself. Generally, the theory that Engelhardt and you are advancing gives us a very optimistic picture in the long run, a picture of steady progress. However, if we look at the long run, we see that sometimes there were periods of progress that were followed by periods of terrible setbacks. For instance, the Belle Epoque was followed by rather nasty events, And there are many more examples in history, back to the Roman civilization that confirm this. And I wonder if there is, given what we are experiencing these days, it's time for us to also look at the causes and consequences of these setbacks. Sorry, it's not entirely linked to your presentation, but it's just a general thought.
It's interesting that you bring that up because I thought that with this topic I have already done a little bit of a turn because I'm looking at a dark variable as my dependent variable and not at the rosy end of the scale. And I also thought this lends itself well to the current trends that we observe. We have countries like Singapore, China, where authoritarianism is not challenged as it seems right now. So it's resilient. We have countries where it is reviving. Turkey, not speaking of this place here. We have countries in the European Union, Hungary, Poland, where we have clear authoritarian tendencies, and even in mature Western democracies. We have now Trump. We have the alternative for Germany. In Germany, we have Front National, and it's right now we have, it seems like a move, a cycle at least. Yeah, I would predict it's temporary. It's a cycle and not a sustainable trend, but we will see. But yeah, I'm one of the reasons why I picked that topic is also because of that trend. Of course, if you go back to Engelhardt and my earlier writings, we always said that the positive outcome is conditional. And the condition is that the economic system, basic life resources, that this is not in jeopardy. If that is in jeopardy, of course, the logic of the whole theory that we have will as well explain downward trends.
Thank you. Yes, Anna?
Thanks for the nice talk, Chris. I enjoyed it a lot, as usual. I have just one minor remark, which might be of interest. You mentioned that the refusal to answer could be an indicator of being discontent, right? Especially in authoritarian countries. And that translates very clearly, and that's why we would be looking for that, greater percentage of those people who refuse to answer certain questions. But then on the other hand, we may not expect the same freedoms of speech even in answering the questions in authoritarian and democratic societies. So if in a democracy it's okay to refuse to answer some questions, in an authoritarian country it might be already, there might be already some kind of threshold that you should answer any question you're asked. So in my opinion that could be not a very valid way to to assess that, because as much as researchers can read the refusal to answer as as a discontent, also authorities may read that in exactly the same way. And so to avoid that, you kind of do not abstain from answering any question you are asked. Just this remark. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a valid point. In the end, I cannot ultimately prove that point because I cannot open people's brain and look inside. So there is no way to be absolutely certainly for sure. So this is more like a test with indications. But we had also other things. So we had three different takes on possible non-attitudes or false preferences. So one was non-response. We also looked at maybe people give random answers sometimes, in which case we measure non-attitudes. In random answers could be reflected in contradictory responses. We have actually one good or two good opportunities to look at that. So we have a question in the beginning of the survey which asks people to indicate on a 4-point scale how important politics is for them in their lives. So very important, fairly unimportant, very unimportant. A bit later in the questionnaire comes another question that asks, how interested are you personally in politics? Very interested, fairly uninterested, totally uninterested. What I did here, I looked whether a respondent is on opposite ends of those two scales. So someone saying it's very important in my life and later saying I'm totally uninterested, or the other way around. I coded that. I gave such respondents a code 1 and everyone else a 0, and I said the 1 is a contradictory response style, and then I percentaged per country how many people do we have there. So that was one issue to look at, and then we have that that a little bit scary issue of duplicate responses, which are a hint to faked data. The Indian sample, for instance, has 39% perfectly identical rows, so to speak, in the data matrix, and that's, of course, it's a quality issue, you know. So we looked at these kinds of things, and we did not get from these different perspectives an indication that the response patterns we get from less democratic countries are less reliable than those we get from free countries.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I just have got a question about the countries where Russia was far higher on the indices of authoritarian notion of democracy than, for example, Belarus or Azerbaijan, where the Aliyev family has been ruling for quite a long. It would be very interesting if you could comment on that. And the other graph that was with bars.
Okay.
This one. Yeah, exactly. And I think this is statistically significant as far as I could figure out from the scale.
You mean if these differences are significant?
I mean, for example, Belarus and Azerbaijan are much lower on these indices compared to Russia. And would be very interesting if you could comment on that.
Because they're probably even more authoritarian.
Yeah, that could be. No, I cannot. I don't know why a country is, and this is not the point of my explanation. I'm not explaining whether a country is on rank 20 or 25, or why two countries having, the point of those countries is they are somewhere in the gray zone in the middle. Whether the one is a little bit, a couple of ranks higher up than the other, that's not the target of I want to explain the overall pattern. So I'm not probing too much into why is this country above that one. That was not the point. Especially if they're somewhat in the same ballpark in the first place.
Okay, and perhaps this concludes then our question and answer session. Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you.